They built the Severance under a sky that was not a sky, in the yards at Tiburon Deep, where the sun is a hard white coin too far away to warm anything, and the only weather is the slow drift of welding sparks like ash that never falls. I have walked those gantries for 3 years now, and I have learned to read the work the way I once read a battle line. You can tell a ship's purpose by how the yards treat it. A patrol cutter is built fast and loose, hands moving without ceremony. A flagship is built slow, with men standing back to look. The Severance was built without anyone standing back at all. No one looked at it the way you look at a thing you are proud of. They built it the way a surgeon lays out instruments before a procedure he has performed too many times to feel anything but certainty about the outcome. I am Corwin Ash. They made me a fleet admiral after Anvil Gate, which is a strange thing to do to a man who lost a squadron, but the people who pinned the rank on me understood that they were not rewarding a victory. They were marking a debt. I have come to think of the star on my collar as a receipt. It says, "This man carries the account. This man will see it closed." I want to set down what happened plainly, while my memory of it is still cold enough to be accurate. Heat distorts. Rage rounds the numbers up and the faces down until everything becomes a story you tell to feel better, and I have never once felt better. So I will give it to you the way it was given to me, in sequence, in figures, in the exact words spoken, and the exact silences that followed them. The men and women who died at Anvil Gate deserve the precision. It is the only thing I have left to give them. We had been allied with the Oltaran League for 9 years when they killed us. That is the part outsiders never sit with long enough. 9 years. Not a treaty signed in a corridor and forgotten, a working alliance, with our crews aboard their ships and theirs aboard ours, with joint patrols and shared codes and the kind of trust that gets built one boring shift at a time, the trust of people who have stood the same watches and waited out the same long silences together. I had personally served beside an Oltaran shipmaster called Sevet of the Third Reckoning for 2 of those years, on the cordon out past the Marwick Drift, and if you had asked me, if you had put me under oath and asked me whether that creature would ever turn its guns on my people, I would have laughed at you. Not because I was naive, because I had watched it pull 3 of my wounded out of a venting compartment with its own segmented hands when its own crew told it the math did not favor the rescue. It overrode the math that day. I saw it do it. I should tell you what those 2 years on the Marwick cordon were actually like, because the alliance was not an abstraction signed by people who never met. It was watches. It was the long, flat hours of a patrol arc where nothing happens and nothing is supposed to, and you fill them with the only thing there is to fill them with, which is the other crew. Sevet's vessel and mine ran the same arc for 2 years, close formation, close enough that we shared a tactical net, and after a while, shared the small things a net is not built for. The Oltarans have a custom they call the marking of the watch. At the turn of each shift, the standing officer logs not what happened but what was held, what was kept intact through the watch, and they had no word for it that translated, so my people started calling it the keeping. Sevet logged its keeping to my bridge every shift for 2 years out of a courtesy nothing required, and my watch officers logged hours back. And somewhere in the 2nd year, it stopped being a courtesy and became the thing that made the boredom bearable. The light in our cabins is brighter than what the Oltarans prefer. Their light is a deep amber, almost the color of old brass, and when we ran joint exercises aboard their ship I learned to read by it. And the smell of their air, which is drier than ours and carries a faint mineral edge like the inside of a long-sealed tank, became a smell I associated with safety, because it was the smell of the ally at my flank. That is how deep it goes. An alliance held one watch at a time. It gets into your nose. It changes what the word safe smells like. I tell you this so that when I tell you what they did, you understand that they did it to people who had let the smell of Oltaran air mean safety, and that this is the specific organ they cut. So I have to begin by telling you that the Oltarans were not monsters in the way you want them to be. That is the harder truth, and the niche of monstrousness that they actually occupied is one most species never have to think about, because most species would simply not survive long enough beside humans to demonstrate it. The Oltarans were a consensus people. Where we have admirals and parliaments and slow arguments, they had the calculus, a civilizational decision engine, part machine, part priesthood, that took in every commitment a league vessel or citizen had made and weighed it continuously against every other commitment and every changing fact, and returned a verdict on what the league owed and to whom. An Oltaran oath was sincere. I want to be exact about that. When Sevet swore to stand the cordon beside me, it meant it with everything it had. But the oath was an entry in the calculus, and the calculus was always running, and an entry that is always being weighed against new facts is not a promise. It is a position, and a position can be revised. We knew this about them. Our analysts had written it up. I had read the assessments. We knew that the Oltaran word was provisional in a way ours was not, that the calculus could in principle compute its way to abandoning any commitment if the arithmetic shifted far enough. But knowing a thing as a line in a report, and believing it about the creature that pulled your wounded out of the dark are two different organs of the mind, and the second one does not read reports. So when the call came to take Anvil Gate, and the League offered to fight beside us, every human officer who had ever served with them said yes without a flicker. I said yes. I requested it. Anvil Gate is a choke point, a single navigable corridor through a hypergeant's gravity well, the only fast way between the Drenok hegemony's core worlds and the soft frontier, where 40 million of our colonists lived in habitats that had never been built to take a hit. The Drenok had been bleeding our frontier for 2 years, raids and snatch-and runs, and the strategists finally agreed. Take Anvil Gate, hold the corridor, and the raids stop because the raiders can no longer reach the colonies in less than a year of slow flight. It was a good plan. It was the kind of plan that saves civilians without spending many of them, which is the only kind of plan I ever truly liked. The League wanted Anvil Gate too. Their reasons were their own. The calculus had determined that controlling the corridor improved the League's position by some margin I was never shown. But our interests ran parallel, and parallel interests are the bedrock of every alliance that has ever held. So we planned the action together, in a real planning room with real disagreements, and we built a joint order of battle, my 3rd Cordon Squadron, 19 ships on the human side, and a League formation of roughly equal weight under a shipmaster I had not met, called Orin of the Closed Account. Sevet was not at Anvil Gate. I have thought about that a great deal. I do not know whether it would have changed anything. I want to believe it would have. The calculus does not care what I want to believe. I met Orin twice before the action, both times across the planning table, and I will be honest that I did not warm to it the way I had to Sevet, though I could not have told you why. It was correct in every dealing. It was precise, prepared, and it gave good counsel. When my staff proposed committing the trailing edge too early, it was Orin who walked us back, drew the timing tighter, saved us from a mistake that would have cost ships even in a battle we won cleanly. I remember thinking that I was glad to have it, and I remember a small cold thing underneath the gladness that I did not examine, and should have the sense that I was dealing not with a creature, but with the output of a process, that Orin's correctness was the correctness of a function returning a value, and that a function will return a different value the instant its inputs change. Its name carried it plainly, and I did not read it. The closed account. Among the Oltarans, a closed account is one that has been settled and balanced and requires no further entries, and they take their names from the standing of their lineage in the calculus. And I knew that. It was in the assessments. And I sat across from a creature called the closed account and planned a battle with it, and did not once ask myself what it would do when a new entry arrived large enough to reopen the book. That failure is mine. I have not forgiven myself for it, and I do not intend to, because a man who forgives himself for the thing he should have seen tends to fail to see it the next time, and there must not be a next time. We trained the joint formation for 9 days in the staging system before the action. Drills, deconfliction, The unglamorous work of teaching two navies to fire past each other without hitting each other in the close quarters of a gravity well. My crews drilled beside Oren's crews. They ate in shifts in the same staging hangar, ours and theirs, and I walked that hangar on the seventh night and saw a knot of my junior ratings teaching a cluster of young Oltarans a human card game, all of them laughing in the two different ways the two species laugh, and I stood in the dark at the edge of the hangar and felt the particular contentment of a commander who believes his people are safe among friends. I have gone back to that hangar in my mind more times than I can count. Some of those ratings are dead. Some of those young Oltarans are alive today on a patrolled world, and I do not know which of them, on the day the calculus revised, kept laughing and which of them manned the guns, and I have decided not to find out because there is no answer that helps. The plan put the two formations on opposite faces of the corridor, a pincer, so that when the Dreadnought main body committed to the gate we would close on it from both sides and crush it against the gravity well it could not retreat into. My squadron held the trailing edge. The League held the leading edge. Between us, the corridor and into the corridor on schedule, almost insulting in their confidence, came the Dreadnought, 340 warships, a real fleet, the largest force they had ever massed, because they had finally understood that losing Anvil Gate meant losing the frontier, and they had decided to spend everything to keep it. I will not pretend the first hour was anything but what we wanted. The Dreadnought committed. We closed. The corridor lit up the way a corridor does when two fleets meet inside a gravity well, which is to say it became, briefly, the most violent place in that arm of the galaxy. A gravity well does strange things to a battle. It bends the firing solutions, drags the debris into long luminous arcs that fall in toward the hypergean and burn, paints the whole engagement in the hard actinic light of a star too close, so that you fight in a perpetual white noon with no shadows and no place to hide a ship. We had drilled for it. The Dreadnought had not drilled for us. They came in fast and confident on the standard raider doctrine, mass and speed, and they met a cordon squadron that had spent 2 years on the Marwick learning to fight in exactly this kind of light. And for the first half hour, the killing ran our way so cleanly that I remember a tightness in my chest that I mistook for tension, and was actually something closer to grief held off. The grief of a man watching 340 ships full of living creatures be turned into those long burning arcs. Even creatures who had come to raid my colonies, because I have never once enjoyed it and I distrust the men who do. We lost the Brevard in the first 20 minutes, broken in half by a lance that came through her dorsal armor where the well had bent the Dreadnought solution into a seam we had not expected, and I gave the order that turned the squadron 3 degrees to close the seam, and we did not lose another that way. We lost the little Havenford not long after, a scout-rated ship that should never have been on a line of battle, and was there because the action needed her sensors, and she died doing her job, feeding us the Dreadnought dispositions to the last second of her existence. I felt those losses the way you feel losses in a battle you are winning, as a price, grim but accounted for, the necessary spending of a plan that was working. The Dreadnought main body was committed now, deep in the corridor, their retreat sealed behind them by the geometry of the well, and Oren's formation pressed in from the leading edge exactly as we had drawn it, beautiful coordinated fire, the consensus fleet moving as a single organism, every hull solution computed against every other's so that not one shot was wasted, and not one shot endangered us. I watched it on the plot and I thought, as a professional thinks, that I had never seen fire managed so well, and I thought, as a friend thinks, that I was glad they were on our side. The Oltaran League fought beside us like the allies they had been for 9 years, and I had no reason on the face of the universe to think anything else. The calculus revised at 2:14 fleet time. I know the time because my flag bridge logged it, and the log survived, because the log is hardened against everything including me. At 2:14, with the Dreadnought main body committed and broken-backed in the corridor, with their retreat sealed and their destruction a matter of arithmetic. The Oltaran formation under Oranov the closed account ceased fire on the Drenok. It did not flee. It did not fail. It turned as a single coordinated body, all of it at once, the way only a consensus fleet can turn, and it fired on us. I need you to understand the geometry of what that meant, because the geometry is the whole crime. We were positioned for a pincer. Our backs were to the open corridor. Our weapons and our armor and our attention were all forward into the Drenok, where the enemy was supposed to be. The League was behind and beside us, in the place you put the people you trust, the place where you do not keep your guns trained, because keeping your guns trained on an ally is the one thing an alliance exists to make unnecessary. Oran's formation fired into the soft backs of 19 human warships at a range where missing was not possible. The Anvil, my flagship, took the first salvo on her unarmored stern and lost her drive section, and most of her after third in a single breath. I was on the flag bridge forward, and the deck came up and hit me, and the lights died, and in the dark I heard the ship's spine fail. A sound I will not try to describe except to say that it is the sound of 14,000 tons of certainty becoming 14,000 tons of debris, and once you have heard it you do not need it described. We lost 17 ships in 11 minutes, not to the Drenok, to the Allies positioned behind us, firing into backs that had been turned toward them in trust. I have the 11 minutes in fragments, because the head injury took the smooth thread of it and left me only the pieces, and I have reassembled the order from the log and the fragments, and I trust the order, but I will not pretend to the smoothness. The Anselm's spine failing first, in the dark, that sound. Then the emergency lights coming up red and the flag bridge tilting because the drive section was gone and the ship was beginning to tumble slowly around a center of mass that had moved. Then my flag captain, a steady woman named Idris Holt, who had served with me 11 years, reading the plot in a voice with nothing in it, the trained flat voice, saying, "The League is firing on us, sir. The League is firing on us." The second time, not because I had not heard, but because she had not yet believed her own first sentence. Then the plot itself, which I will carry to my grave, 19 friendly contacts, and one by one the symbols changing, the Takoa's icon stuttering and going to the open ring that means hull breach uncontrolled, the Greywaters going dark all at once, which is worse because dark means there was no time even to register the breach, the Mercer, the Lindorn. The long, cold list of them dimming on the board while the Oltaran contacts behind them burned steady and bright and untouched, because we never fired back. That is the detail I need you to hold. We never fired back. Not out of nobility, out of disbelief. By the time the disbelief broke, there was almost nothing left to fire with, and the few guns that could still bear were crude by people who had spent 9 years being taught that the contacts behind them were the ones you did not shoot, and the teaching held a half-second too long, and a half-second in a gravity well is a ship. Holt got the forward section sealed before the tumble opened them to vacuum. She did that with a console that was failing under her hands and a deck that was no longer reliably down, and she did it because it was the procedure, and she was the kind of officer who runs the procedure while the world ends, and it is the only reason I am alive to set this down, and she did not make it off the Anselm herself. I want her name in this. Idris Holt. She held the pressure that held the 400. The list of what the Oltarans took includes her, and her name is not a ship, and I read the ships at the launch and not the people, and I have told you I regret that, and this is me, here, in the only record I control, reading one of the people. Idris Holt. 14,040 human beings died at Anvil Gate in those 11 minutes. And almost none of them died facing the thing that killed them. They died looking the right way. They died doing exactly what the plan and the alliance and 9 years of trust had told them to do, which was to keep their attention on the enemy and their backs to the friend. I have signed a great many letters since. I have not yet found a way to write that sentence to a mother that does not feel like a second betrayal, that her son died well, died at his post, died looking the right way, and that looking the right way is precisely what killed him. There is no order of those words that does not break something in the reader, and so I have stopped trying to soften it, and I write it plain, because the plainness is the only respect I have found that does not curdle into a lie. A few of us lived. I will not dress it up. The Anselm's forward sections held pressure long enough for the rescue tenders to reach us once the firing stopped, and the firing stopped, because once we were broken, there was nothing left to compute. I was pulled off the dead flag bridge with a crushed hand and a head that did not work correctly for some weeks. Perhaps 400 of my people came out of that corridor alive across all 19 ships. I do not give you that as a number to feel hopeful about. I give it to you so you understand that there were witnesses, that this is not a story reconstructed from wreckage, that human eyes watched the Oltaran formation turn and human ears heard, on the open channel, the message Orin of the closed account sent us as his guns cooled. He did not gloat. The Oltarans do not gloat. Gloating is a luxury of creatures who feel they have done something that requires defending. The message was almost gentle. Translated, it ran, "The calculus has revised. The League's position is improved by sole possession of the corridor. Your sacrifice is regretted and has been entered into the account. The League proposes resumed cooperation on revised terms and looks forward to your understanding." He meant every word of it, including the part about looking forward. He genuinely expected us to understand. In the Oltaran frame there was nothing to forgive, because nothing had been broken. The oath had simply been outweighed, the way a smaller number is outweighed by a larger one, and you do not hold a grudge against arithmetic. He expected us to grieve our dead, absorb the new fact, and come back to the table, because that is what reasonable species do. That is what every species the League had ever betrayed had done. The calculus had a long history of revising oaths and a long history of the betrayed parties, in time, returning to negotiate, because the alternative was worse, and the Oltarans were powerful, and the universe is a place where you swallow what you must. That is the assumption that killed them, not malice, an assumption. I was 11 weeks in the medical decks before I could close my repaired hand, and in those 11 weeks the recordings of Orin's message went up the chain of Earth and out across the colonies, and something happened that the calculus, for all its weighing, had no entry for. I want to tell you about those 11 weeks, because the thing that became the severance was born in them, in me, and in 10 billion others at the same time. And I was in a position to watch it happen in myself with the cold attention of a man who had nothing else to do. The first week was pain and the drugs for pain and a head that gave me my own memories out of order, so that I would surface from a half-sleep certain that Holt was still on the net, that the plot still showed 19, and then the order would reassemble and I would lose them all over again, every few hours, the way you lose someone freshly each time you wake in the first days. That is the loud part of grief, and I had it, and I am not ashamed of it. The second and third weeks were the rage, and I will not pretend to a nobility I did not have. I wanted, in those weeks, to do to the Oltarans the thing the old woman would later ask me whether I could refrain from doing. I wanted the frenzy. I lay in that bed and built it in my mind, the burning of their worlds, the screaming, the symmetry of it, and the drugs let me build it, and the building felt, briefly, like relief. And then somewhere in the fourth week it burned out, exactly the way the old woman said a frenzy burns out. And what was underneath it was the thing I have been trying to describe to you and have not got right yet, because there is no clean word for it. It was not calm. Calm is warm. It was the absence of the heat that had been standing between me and the facts, and with the heat gone the facts were simply there, cold and complete and arranged in their sequence, and looking at them, I understood something the rage had hidden from me. The rage wanted to hurt the Oltarans. The thing underneath did not care about hurting them at all. It cared about one thing only, with a totality that frightened the medical staff enough that they noted it in my chart. It cared about making the betrayal of a human oath an impossibility in the future arithmetic of the galaxy. The Oltarans were not the target of that. The Oltarans were the demonstration. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of what I have left to defend. There were no riots, that is the part I want the historians to mark. There was no shouting in the streets, no burning of Oltaran goods, no mobs. We are not, despite what other species like to tell themselves about us, a people who riot when we are hurt past a certain depth. Past a certain depth we go quiet. The colonies went quiet. Earth went quiet. The frontier that had been saved by the taking of Anvil Gate, the 40 million who would have been raided if the corridor had stayed open, went quiet too, because they understood before anyone explained it to them that they had been saved by the dead, and that the dead had been killed by the friends who saved them with us. A quiet like that is not grief. Grief is loud at the start. A quiet like that is grief that has already finished its first work and moved on to its second, which is decision. I came out of the medical decks into a navy that had decided. No one had announced it. There had been no vote I could point to, no speech. But I walked the corridors of the orbital where I convalesced, and I felt it the way you feel a change in cabin pressure before the alarm sounds, a settling, a hardening, 10 billion people quietly arriving at the same conclusion at the same time without needing to say it aloud. The conclusion was this: there would be no return to the table. There would be no revised terms. The Oltaran League had taken something from us that could not be entered into any account and balanced, because the thing they took was not the 14,040, terrible as that was. The thing they took was the meaning of a human oath standing beside an Oltaran one. They had demonstrated in 11 minutes that to them our word and theirs were the same kind of object, a position, revisable, weighable, outweighable. And we are not built to live in a universe where that is true. We had to make it untrue. We had to make the cost of revising an oath sworn to humanity so total, so absolute, so far beyond any possible gain the calculus could ever compute, that no entry in any decision engine anywhere would ever again return the verdict that betraying us improved a position. That is what the severance was for. Not revenge, though it was that too. It was a correction to the arithmetic of the galaxy. It was the insertion of a single, unmovable, infinite number into every other species' calculus, the number that says, an oath to Earth cannot be outweighed because the penalty for revising it is the end of you. They gave me the account because I carried it already. There was a hearing, of a kind. Earth does not do these things without a record, and I told them what I have told you in sequence in figures, and at the end an old woman who chaired the panel, a civilian, asked me one question. She asked whether I could do it without hatred. Whether I could prosecute the unmaking of an entire interstellar civilization, 12 worlds and 40 billion living Oltarans, the great majority of whom had never fired on anyone, as a cold and methodical and exact procedure, and not as a frenzy. Because a frenzy, she said, is what they expect, and a frenzy is something the calculus can model, and a frenzy burns out. She wanted to know if I could give them something they could not model. I told her the truth. I told her that the hatred had finished its work in the medical decks 11 weeks ago, and that what was left in its place did not feel like anything at all. It felt like the certainty I had felt about Sevet, turned all the way around and pointed in the only direction it had left to go. She nodded and gave me the yards at Tybron Deep, and 3 years and 381,000 hulls, and she told me to build the proof. So we built it. I want to be honest about the strangest thing, which is how ordinary it was. There is a story people like to tell, in which a wrong people unveils a secret weapon kept in a vault, a single terrible thing that ends everything in a flash. We had no such thing, and we did not want one, because a single terrible thing is precisely the kind of object the calculus knows how to weigh, a known quantity, a deterrent, a chip. We did not build a weapon. We built an industry. We built, in the dark beyond Tybron, the largest concentration of warship construction in human history, and we did it not because we needed 381,000 ships to defeat the Oltaran League's fleet. Their fleet was perhaps a tenth of that, but because the message was never about defeating their fleet. The message was about the scale of the answer relative to the size of the offense. They turned on 19 ships. We built 381,000. The disproportion was not an excess. The disproportion was the entire point. It was the new entry, written in steel, large enough that no calculus could ever round it down. The yards ran day and shadow for 3 years. I will not pretend it was clean. We pulled whole-grade alloy from asteroid stocks that had been earmarked for habitat expansion, and somewhere a colony that would have grown did not grow, and I signed that too. We trained crews faster than any sane peacetime navy would, and we trained them not for glory but for procedure, for the unglamorous discipline of doing the same exact thing across 40 billion lives without once letting it become personal enough to be sloppy. I lived in those years the way a foreman lives, which is to say in the noise and the rhythm of the work, and I came to know the yards at Tiburon deep the way I had once known the Marwick cordon, as a place with its own weather and its own watches. The construction halls were vast enough to hold a city, and they were never silent, and the sound of them was not the sound of war but the sound of manufacture, the deep tidal hum of the fabricators and the clatter of the hull printers laying steel in long automated passes, and under all of it, the small human sounds of 40,000 workers on rotating shifts, the calling out, the tools, the meal lines. There is a thing that happens to a workforce building something at that scale for that reason, and I watched it happen. In the first year there was anger in the halls, the residue of Anvil gait, men working with their jaws set. By the second year the anger had cooked off the way it had cooked off in me, and what replaced it was worse to look at and better for the work. A flat, total competence. A workforce that had stopped thinking of the severance as vengeance and started thinking of it as a thing that simply had to be made correctly, the way you make a sea wall correctly, because the consequences of making it wrong fall on people who trusted you. I would walk the meal lines and hear them talk, and they did not talk about the Oltarans. They talked about tolerances. They talked about the work. That is what discipline sounds like from the inside. It sounds like people who have put the reason away in a locked place and kept only the task, because the task done well is the only form the reason can safely take. We did not build identical ships. That was deliberate too. A fleet of one design is a fleet the enemy learns once and counters forever, and the severance was meant to be unlearnable. Wedged dreadnoughts and blunt-nosed gun platforms and the long, lean interdiction cruisers, and the squat carriers that were really just engines for delivering smaller things. 381,000 hulls across 40 patterns, no two squadrons quite alike, so that the calculus, which won its battles by modeling its enemy, would find that the enemy could not be reduced to a model. We were not building a weapon for it to weigh. We were building a thing it could not finish weighing before it died. And I want to be plain that this required no genius and no secret. It required only that a species capable of building habitats for 40 million people decide, for once, to point that whole industrial capacity at a single end and refuse to be talked out of it. The terrible thing about humans at scale is not our cleverness. It is our patience. We will build a sea wall for 3 years against a flood that has not yet come, and we will build a severance for 3 years against a betrayal that has already happened, and we will not stop. And we will not be bargained down, and the Oltarans, who could revise any commitment in an afternoon, had no concept for a people who could hold a commitment for 3 years through every inducement to abandon it. The yards themselves were the message. Long before the first hull sailed, the existence of the yards said the thing we needed said. An oath to earth cannot be outweighed, and here, in steel, is the proof that we will spend whatever it costs to make that true. The Oltarans found out, of course. You cannot hide an industry of that scale forever, and we did not try very hard past the first year, because being found out was part of the procedure. When the calculus finally registered what was being built beyond Tiburon Deep, the League did exactly what the old woman on the panel had predicted. They came to the table. Orin of the closed account himself sent the first overture, then his superiors, then the League's central voices, escalating as the scale of what we were building became clear to them. The messages were reasonable. They were, I will grant, even generous by Oltaran standards, extraordinarily so. They offered reparations. They offered the corridor at Anvil Gate freely, permanently. They offered the surrender and execution of every officer in Oran's formation, which their own calculus had computed as a fair entry to balance the account. They could not understand why the offers did not move us, and as the months passed and the hulls kept multiplying and we did not answer, their messages changed character. They became, by degrees, the closest thing an Oltaran ever comes to fear, which is bewilderment, a creature watching its arithmetic fail to predict the world. They kept raising the offer. They did not understand that there was no number that would balance the account, because we had stopped using their unit of measure. You cannot pay off a debt in a currency the creditor no longer recognizes. We answered them once, near the end of the second year, after a transmission in which the League's central voices, in a tone I can only call pleading, asked us to name our terms, any terms, and promised the calculus would compute a way to meet them. I drafted the reply myself, and I let it go out under my name because the account was mine. It was short. It said, "There are no terms. An oath to earth is not a position. We will demonstrate this." That was all. I did not threaten them because a threat is an offer. It implies that there is a behavior that purchases safety, and there was not, and I would not lie to them even at the end. I simply told them what was true. I think that message did more to the calculus than the 381,000 hulls, a weapon it could weigh. An entry that refused, on principle, to be weighed, was a thing it had no model for at all, and I have wondered since whether, in some distributed and inhuman way, the League understood in that moment that it had already ended itself. 2 years gone, in 11 minutes it could not take back. We sailed in the third year when the last yard at Tiburon Deep emptied and the severance hung in the dark complete. I gave no speech. There is a great human appetite for a speech at such moments, and I understand it, but a speech would have made it a passion, and it was not a passion. It was the discharge of an obligation. The closest thing to ceremony was a list, the 17 ships, read aloud once on the command channel, not as a battle cry but as a roll, the way you read a roll, so that the people doing the work would do it for the right reason and not for excitement. The Toccoa, the Greywater, the Mercer, the Anselm, the Lindorn, all of them. 14,040 names would have taken too long to read, and I have always regretted that we read the ships and not the people. But the ships were what I had room for, and I read them, and then we went. I will not give you the campaign as a thrill, because it was not one, and to make it one would be to hand the calculus exactly the frenzy it had hoped for, 3 years too late. I will give it to you as it was, a procedure, executed in sequence, against a civilization that fought us with everything it had and could not change the outcome by a single day. The Oltaran fleet met us first, at the edge of their space, the whole of it, perhaps 38,000 hulls under the consensus command of the League's finest, and they fought well. I want that on the record too, because the niche of contempt is one I refuse to occupy. They were not cowards and they were not fools. They were a capable, ancient, formidable people who had simply made one assumption about us that turned out to be fatal, and at the edge of their space, they spent themselves trying to disprove the consequence of that assumption. They did not run. Their calculus, I think, had finally computed that there was nowhere to run to, that an instrument of 381,000 hulls executing a verdict does not stop at a fleet, and so they chose to die in front of their worlds rather than behind them. It took 6 days. We lost 12,000 of our own people doing it, real losses, men and women I had trained on the Tiburon gantries, and I felt each report come in the way I had felt the Brevard and the Havenford as a price accounted for. When it was done, the Oltaran League had no fleet, and we had not yet reached a single one of their worlds. I commanded the engagement from the lead dreadnought of the second wave, a ship without a name because I had ordered the Severance built without names, every hull a number, so that no crew would come to love its ship the way my people had loved the Anselm and the Toccoa, so that nothing in the fleet could be made into a story. From that bridge, I watched the largest battle in the history of either species, and I will tell you that it did not look like the battles in the recordings the young men watch. There was no swarming chaos. The Oltaran consensus fleet fought as it had always fought, as one organism. Every hull's fire computed against every other's, and against any other enemy in the arm it would have been unanswerable. Against us it was answerable only because we had built ourselves on purpose to be the thing it could not compute. 40 patterns, no two squadrons alike, a fleet with no doctrine to learn because it had been assembled out of 40 doctrines at once. So the battle became a thing the calculus had never faced, a contest it could model perfectly and still lose, because the model kept returning the same verdict, that it was outweighed, and the Oltarans had spent 10,000 years trusting the model and could not stop trusting it now. They fought beautifully and they died in order, formation by formation, and on the 6th day the last of them turned not to flee but to face us. The whole remaining strength of the League gathered in front of its own worlds, and made the only choice the calculus had left them, which was to die where their people could see it done rather than to leave their people undefended for a single hour more. I gave them that. I held the fleet and let them come, and we ended it cleanly, in the open, in front of the worlds they were dying for, and I logged the time, because the men and women who died on our side in those 6 days deserve the precision as much as the men and women who died at Anvil Gate, and I have given it to both. Here is where I must tell you the hardest part, the part that I have turned over in the long shifts on the gantries and the longer shifts since, the part I am still not certain I have the right to be at peace about. We did not stop at the fleet. The fleet was the only thing on the Oltaran side that could be called a combatant, and we destroyed it. And then we went on, world by world, 12 worlds, and we unmade the League. I will give you the shape of how it was done, because the shape is the thing that distinguishes a severance from a slaughter, and I have spent a great deal of my life since insisting on that distinction to people who do not want to hear it. At each world we did the same procedure, in the same order, with the same patience. First we took the high orbit and held it, total and unhurried, so that the world below understood it was already lost and that nothing it did would change that, because a creature that knows it cannot win fights differently than one that hopes. Then we found the nodes. Every Oltaran world carried its piece of the calculus. The consensus engines, the great distributed processors and their priesthood, the relays that let one world's weighing speak to another's, the whole vast nervous system of the thing that had taught them their word was provisional. We had spent 3 years learning where those nodes were, and we struck them and only them methodically, one after another, with a precision that cost us more in time and risk than carpet destruction would have, but that was the entire point, because we were not there to kill Oltarans. We were there to kill the calculus, and the calculus did not die easily. It fought us with the worlds it ran, threw their defenses at us in patterns that were genuinely brilliant and genuinely doomed, and we absorbed the losses and kept to the procedure and broke the nodes, one world, then the next, on a schedule we did not accelerate for rage and did not slow for mercy. It took 14 months. I want that duration to sit with you, because 14 months is not the time it takes to destroy 12 worlds. We could have burned all 12 in a fortnight, and the calculus surely computed that we would, and the fact that we did not was its own message. 14 months is the time it takes to do a careful thing carefully. We patrolled while we worked. We let the Oltaran civilians live, 40 billion of them, on worlds whose sky now held our hulls, and whose every attempt to rebuild a single consensus node we detected and ended within hours, until the attempt stopped, because even a people who treat oaths as positions can eventually compute that this particular position will not improve no matter how it is revised. The hardest days were not the fighting. The hardest days were the quiet ones in the long orbits, when the work at a given world was done, and we held station above a population that hated us, watching them learn to live without the engine that had organized their every decision for longer than humans had had writing, and knowing that we had reached into the mind of a civilization, and removed the specific organ that had wronged us, and that this was, by any measure, a more total thing to do to a people than killing some of them would have been. I do not hide from that. A man who hides from the weight of what he did at scale will do it lightly the next time, and there must not be a next time. We unmade a way of thinking. We did it on purpose. I believe it was necessary, and I will not call it clean, and I hold both of those at once, every day in sequence, in figures, exactly as it was. 40 billion Oltarans live today. They live in a quiet they did not choose, on worlds we patrol and do not occupy, under a single standing condition that we have never once had to enforce because the demonstration was enough. That they will not rebuild the calculus, that they will keep their oaths the way the rest of us keep them, as promises, on pain of the return of the severance. They hate us, I am told, with a depth their old arithmetic could never have produced, and I do not blame them, and I do not need them to forgive me, and I have made my peace with their hatred the way you make peace with weather. It is real, and it does not move me. What moves me is the other thing, the thing the old woman on the panel asked me to build, the entry in every other calculus in the galaxy. Because the galaxy was watching. Of course it was watching. There were a dozen powers who had alliances with Earth and 100 more who were considering them, and every one of them watched the severance go to Tybron Deep empty and come back empty and leave the Oltaran League population without an engine, a people who had been the most formidable consensus civilization in the arm, and were now, by our hand, a quiet thing under patrol. And every one of those powers ran the arithmetic. Every one of them computed, in whatever organ they compute with, the cost of revising an oath sworn to humanity, and every one of them arrived at the same number, the number we had spent 3 years writing in steel: infinite. Not large, infinite. A cost that cannot be outweighed by any gain, because the thing it costs you is not a fleet or a world or a generation. It is the end of you as a thing that decides. The treaties changed after. I have read them. The other powers do not write it openly. No one writes a clause that says we will not betray the humans because of what they did to the Oltarans, but it is there in the structure, in the way every commitment to Earth is now phrased as an absolute, where commitments to others are phrased as positions. They learned the law we taught them. An oath to us is not a line in an engine. It is a promise, and a promise broken to us is not a debt to be balanced. It is a severance, and the severance is total, and it does not return to the table. People ask me, the ones who are brave enough, whether it was worth it, whether 40 billion living under a hatred they did not choose, whether 12 worlds severed from the engine of their own thought, whether the colony that did not grow because we took the alloy, whether all of it was worth the answer to a wrong done to 14,040 people who are still, at the end of every accounting, dead. I do not have a clean answer, and I distrust anyone who offers one. What I have is the geometry of Anvil Gate, the 17 ships with their backs turned in trust, and the certainty that if we had returned to the table, if we had grieved and absorbed and negotiated and accepted that a human oath standing beside an alien one is a position to be outweighed, then every alliance Earth ever signs would be signed in that same provisional ink, and one day, on some other corridor, some other admiral's people would die looking the right way. The severance bought a universe in which that is no longer arithmetic. I do not know if that is worth it. I know it is what the dead were owed. I still walk the yards at Tybron Deep, though they are quiet now, the great construction halls dark and the gantries empty, kept ready the way you keep a thing ready that you pray never to use again and intend to use without hesitation if you must. The severance is dispersed, parceled out to 100 patrol stations across the frontier, a hull here and a squadron there. The industry that built it converted back to the building of habitats, and the alloy returned in time to the colonies it was borrowed from. There is no monument. We did not want one. A monument is a story, and a story softens, and the entry we wrote was meant never to soften. The monument is the empty quiet over 12 Oltaran worlds and the single clause in 100 treaties, and the fact that in the 9 years since, no power anywhere has revised an oath sworn to Earth. not because they love us, but because they have done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic now returns the only verdict we ever wanted it to return. Sevet of the Third Reckoning is dead. It was not at Anvil Gate, and it had no part in the betrayal, and I want that on the record, but it was Oltaran, and the calculus it lived by was the thing we severed, and it did not survive the loss of the engine that had given its life its shape. I am told it sent a message, near the end, addressed to me by name, and I have never read it, and I never will, because there is nothing it could say that would change the geometry of Anvil Gate, and I will not let the memory of 3 of my wounded pulled out of the dark by its hands argue with the memory of 14,040 of my people who were not pulled out of anything. Both of those things are true. I have learned to hold them at once. That is the cost of carrying the account. You do not get to set down the part that hurts in order to keep the part that comforts. You carry all of it in sequence, in figures, exactly as it was, and you do not round the dead down to make the answer easier to live with. They built the severance under a sky that was not a sky, and I watched them build it, and I gave the order that sent it out, and I would give it again. Not because the rage demanded it. The rage finished its work 11 weeks after Anvil Gate, in a medical bed, and never came back. I would give it again for the same reason. The surgeon lays out the instruments before a procedure he has performed too many times to feel anything but certainty about, because the wound left no other choice that would not leave a deeper one, and because some accounts can only be closed by writing, in a number large enough to be read from anywhere in the galaxy. The one truth the Oltaran League died failing to compute. An oath to humanity is not a position. It is the last thing you ever break.